church provoke Israel to jealousy, but when it says, you should not defend yourselves against terrorists, you have a situation that there's an enemy trying to destroy this tiny little nation because it's trying to break prophecy. It's trying to break the restoration of all things. And it continues on here. Now notice this real close. Watch this. Now if their trespass means riches for the world, if they rejected the Messiah, so the door opened up for me as a Gentile to walk into the Jewish Messiah and to all the inheritance that he has, he says this, if their trespass means riches for the world and their failure means riches for the Gentiles, the question is, how much more will their inclusion mean? Or in other words, what happens when they do believe that Jesus is their Messiah? See, the blessing is when they come to faith, that actually opens up everything for the entire body. Charles Spurgeon said this in the 1800s. I do not think that we attach enough importance to the restoration of the Jews, those that were the first missionaries, the first apostles who to us who are far off, for they shall be regathered in again. Then he said this, until that shall be, the church's glory can never come. Matchless benefits are tied to the spiritual restoration of Israel, for their regathering shall be as life from the dead. And what Spurgeon was quoting was verse 15. If their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? See, the key is not them restored back to the land. The key is them restored back to their Messiah. See, it's the restoration of all things. And what God has been doing in this age is trying to restore everything back to himself. The Jewish people is unlocking a blessing. And if we want to really experience revival, Paul said it begins by praying for revival for the Jews, to the Jew first. If you really want to experience revival, you got to start praying for their salvation, and watch out. As you start praying for their revival, watch revival come back to your own. That there's this symbiotic relationship that God has, that he's made the two one new flesh. He's trying to make one. And he's trying to get Gentiles to really understand how important it is to reach Jewish people with the gospel. And he's trying to unlock the whole understanding for them to say, we need to reach them with the gospel. There's this whole relationship that God is trying to break down this wall between the two. And it's only broken down through the Messiah. It goes on. It gets a little interesting here because, the Jews in the first century, when Peter has the vision and is the clean and unclean animals, he doesn't understand what this means. He never understood that Gentiles were part of the kingdom. And he's shocked that Cornelius comes in, but he's really shocked when they receive the gift of the Holy Spirit like they did. And so they have a meeting in Jerusalem in about 35 AD. In 35 AD, James quotes this passage, and it says this. He quotes Amos 9, 11, and 12. In that day I will raise up the tabernacle of David, which has fallen down, and repair its damages. I will raise up its ruins and rebuild as in the days of old, that they may possess the remnant of Edom, and all the Gentiles are called by my name, declares the Lord who does this. So at the beginning of the age, ready for this? Jews didn't understand how Gentiles were connected to the kingdom process. So it's no wonder at the end of the age, Gentiles don't really understand how the Jews are connected to the kingdom process. Because when James stops here, that's not where the chapter ends. Look what it says in verse 14. Verse 14. Same chapter. The last two verses say, I will bring back the captives of my people Israel, and they shall rebuild the waste cities and inhabit them. In the first century, the Jews were already in the land. Jerusalem was already rebuilt. The temple was there. It was the focal point of worship. The reason why James doesn't quote verse 14 and 15 is because it did not apply at that time. But after 2,000 years, this nation called Israel somehow gets reformed. They start rebuilding the waste cities. So what happened was at the beginning of the age was the Gentiles' inclusion into the kingdom process. And now at the end of the age, the Jews coming back to the land and ultimately coming back to the Messiah tells us that we're approaching the end of the age. Now, what's the whole age about? Now, it continues on. I will plant them on the land. They never again shall be uprooted out of the land that I have given them. This is a promise to Israel. But what's the whole age been about? Well, it's been about the harvest, and that's what the whole passage is about. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper and the treader of grapes, him who sows the seed. The mount shall drip with sweet wine, and all the hills shall flow with it. In a nutshell, it talks about a harvest so abundant, they can't handle the harvest. Now, this is a population curve of the world since the time of Jesus. And if I were to go ahead and explain this, let's say I were to go ahead and plant corn in the ground. Let's say I plant corn in the ground. It is March, April, and I pour water on it. I'm hoping the thing even sprouts. 2 or 3 weeks later, it sprouts. And it's this tiny little plant. And it seems like it doesn't want to grow. And then all of a sudden, it gets to a certain point, and then it just shoots straight up. Well, this is the population of the world. We don't hit our first billion people to right about 1880, 1890. We hit our second billion people right around 1930. And this chart actually ends, we're actually up here, we're at 7.6 billion people. Do you see that the population curve is going straight up, just like a plant would grow? It is going straight up. Now, ready? I want you to grab hold of this concept. You ready for this? For the first 1,900 years, there lived, give or take, 4.5 billion people. And for hypothetical sake, let's say 10% of those people got saved. That would mean that you had 450 million people come into the kingdom for the first 1,900 years. But in our generation, if we hit 9 billion people, right? Let's say 8 billion people, 10% got saved. That would mean that would be 800 million people coming into the kingdom in our generation, or almost double the harvest of every single generation before us combined. People don't understand where we are in the prophetic timeline, that God is getting ready to restore all things back to himself. And we're alive at the greatest time to ever be alive. There's more people now that can be reached with the gospel than any time in the history of mankind. And people don't understand the kingdom that we're getting ready to walk into. Now, I'm getting ready to talk about prophetic events. Things that are getting ready to take place. And very often when people talk about prophecy, they freak people out. I'm going to tell you something. Prophecy is about upbuilding, encouragement, and comfort. When I talk about prophecy, it's because I'm trying to explain how God is trying to restore all things back to himself. And things that are happening now, very often people will go ahead, this is judgment. In one way, it is judgment. But why do things happen? Well, you know, the Bible tells us that if your father loves his son, he will discipline him. Why? Because he's trying to get the son to go the right path. He's trying to turn the son to the right direction. You have to understand that everything is happening now, and we see the intensifying effects. And we say, God is judging the world. Yes, God is judging the world, but what's the reason for that? It's trying to restore mankind back to himself. And the things are getting really, really drastic now. But it's kind of like the parent that has a 15-year-old kid that's really wrapped up in drugs. And they're at wit's end. They're trying to figure out, what are we going to do? And they start taking radical effects. They'll send them off to like Teen Challenge. You know, Teen Challenge is a great ministry that goes ahead and takes kids that are really messed up and gets them really focused on God. You know, they take extreme measures. Why? Because they already know the end and what that means. God created hell. Jesus talked more about hell than Paul never even talked about it. He didn't want to talk about it. He already knows where that path leads. And he's trying desperately to say, wake up. because the fullness of all things is getting ready to take place. I'm getting ready to return. I am trying desperately to wake people up. So when I talk about these events, that is the context by which I'm talking about that God is trying to restore all things back to himself. The Middle East is really a quagmire right now. And you have to understand that you can't look in the Middle East unless you understand it from a spiritual perspective. See, right now we have a secular media that's trying to give you a secular understanding of the Middle East, but how can you secularly understand what's happening if you don't understand what Shiites believe and what Sunnis believe and the different sects of Islam and what they're expecting? So I'm going to go through signs that took place fairly recently. In 2015, we had a series of 4 blood red moons that happened on Hebrew feast days of Passover and Sukkot that happened in back-to-back years. And what tends to happen are people get very focused on signs and they try to tell you something that's coming instead of actually just sitting back and seeing what is actually taking place. Where we get in trouble is we say a rapture is coming. No one knows the day or the hour. Okay? When the 4th blood red moon took place in 2015, it gave us a total tectonic shift in the Middle East because the following day, Russia began airstrikes in Syria. The Russian involvement in Syria intensified. It started right after the blood red moon. But more so, that same week, Israel finds the largest oil field in the world in the Golan Heights. The thing about the Golan Heights, I'm not sure if you can see this, the area is still recognized by the international community as still part of Syria. It doesn't recognize Israel's right to the oil field. And the oil field that they found, ready for this, is billions upon billions. It's 10 times larger than the normal oil field that is found. It is a massive oil field that was found. So what the blood red moon really set the stage up for was Gog-Magog. In the Gog-Magog, where it talks about the nations that surround Israel, and the reason why they come to Israel is to take a spoil or to take its wealth. That's what took place. And very often we're looking at events and we're not understanding how God is working. Instead of trying to say what is coming, just see what happens and then say, this is what just took place. Now, you go a little bit further. This year, we were this close to a massive war. Now, I'm taking you to when Benjamin Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin met, and you can't really see it here, but it is October 23rd that we read this article. At this time, Benjamin Netanyahu is explaining to Vladimir Putin, look, right now Hezbollah has 100 to 150,000 rockets facing Israel. They are building now underground missile facilities, underground missile factories. We will not allow this to take place. We will not allow a continuous state going from Iran to Syria to Lebanon. And this is a deep concern to us. They point out to Putin that this is a red line. What's interesting is just a few days later, Putin establishes, stations his S-400 batteries, and this is the most sophisticated defense systems that the Russians have. And they set it up, ready? This is August 31st in August, just 7 days after the meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu. Now it gets interesting because now on September 1st, the day after, the red line is now established. New Iranian weapons facility in Iran crosses red line. Now this is September 1st. Now September 4th, Israel then has the largest drill taking place in the history of Israel. That's September 4th. Now September 7th, the Israelis go ahead and hit the missile sites and the weapons facilities. If Syria had retaliated, Israel was already ready to go to a full-blown war. It already had its troops on the northern border. And we read a few days later that Russia urged Syria not to respond. And it says here, the official said Moscow advised Syria and Hezbollah not to respond but to concentrate on the big picture. Oops, there we go.